Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. We're continuing on with our series, A Journey to Faith. Tonight we're on lesson 36, and you can see by the title here behind me, it's called Saul, the first king of Israel. You can see there that he's in his armour and the battles that are going on behind. Pretty much Saul's journey when he first came to king was to try and unite the kingdom of Israel as a united kingdom, and he didn't quite get there, but this is his journey, and we're going to have a look tonight at this tail end of the end of Judges period, where we now move into the time of Kings. And of course Saul was elected as the first king. So last week we had a look at how he was actually selected, and this week we start on with his actual journey through his part of the Bible, which is a somewhat brief story in a sense, because he failed to obey God, and so he was replaced. So we'll get underway. As I said, we've been looking at this nationhood to kingship period when Abraham was first called out, and Abraham was called to make a people unto God for his own. And over a period of time we found that they've formed this nation of people. They've gone into the land of Canaan, and of course during the period of Judges we find that the people are not united and they're overrun by foreign powers all the time. They continue to worship foreign gods, and it comes to a point in time where Samuel had them all come together and they finally destroyed their idols and declared their obedience to God. They also asked for an earthly king because Samuel's sons were wicked, and so they asked for a king instead, and this is why we come to this point with King Saul. So when Saul had been elected and anointed as the king, no sooner had he gone to his home in Gibeah when the leader of the Ammonites on the eastern side of the Jordan River went up to besiege a place called Jabesh Gilead. And we'll just put on our first map for tonight. So this map here, we can see this location. This is Jabesh Gilead over here, and we find that part of Saul's journey is actually played out on the other side of the Jordan River, whereas most of the other battles up until now have actually been on this side of the Jordan River. And so all of the people were called to go up to this place up here, which is called Bezek. In 1 Samuel chapter 11 verses 8 to 11, it says that 300,000 men of Israel were joined with 30,000 men of Judah at Bezek to cross the Jordan River to defeat the Ammonites who besieged this place called Jabesh Gilead. So Jesse and his sons, they're all living at Bethlehem, and so some of his sons who were of age would have travelled up amongst these 30,000 men and met with all of the other tribes of Israel together here at Bezek. This is significant as well because this is the first time, of course, that they'd actually come together and fought together in a long period of time. In 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 8, it says the sons of Jesse travelled north through the hill country along the way to Shur, which is this highway that goes up through the hill country, and it said to muster with the men, there was 30,000 of them altogether from Judah. So those two scriptures are reinforcing this pathway of the people moving forwards. So the men of Jabesh, they tried to negotiate a peace treaty with the Ammonite leader Nahash, but he replied in 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 2, I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace to Israel. And so this is a very violent offer. So messengers were sent out to Saul, and he was very angry, and the Spirit of God came upon him. He took a pair of oxen and cut them into pieces, which were sent throughout Israel with messengers. And so going to Jesse's story now, Jesse is living in Bethlehem, and the elders, they would have all come together at the usual place, which was at the entrance to the gate of their town, where all the elders met in the towns. and they would have been approached by this messenger. When they asked the messenger what he had come to tell them, he gave them a raw piece of severed ox meat and said in 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 7, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." So this is a very peculiar story here, because we find there's this threat of eyes being gouged out, and then of course this response where these oxen are cut up into pieces, and of course they're threatened once again, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. So we find here, in the time of Judges, people were all separated, they would fight separate battles, but at this particular point in time we find that the leaders are actually coercing the people and threatening them to make sure that they all come together and fight on the side of the Israelites against a common enemy. And so they're being threatened from both sides. So of course their reaction was immediate. This threat not only confronted anyone who wanted to challenge the authority of their new king, but his very appointment by God. See, we have to understand here that God actually said, yes, go ahead and anoint Saul as the leader. And so if people weren't to follow the leader that was anointed by God, then in essence the people were now refusing to follow God and be obedient to God's will. So the loss of their oxen to till the fields and grind their grain would have had a devastating impact on their ability to produce and process their crops into food. So this threat was done in such a way that it was real and it had an impact on each and every one of them wherever they lived. The men in Bethlehem, who were 20 years of age or older, would have assembled together and bid farewell to their families once again. Jesse would have hugged and kissed his eldest boys before blessing them and sending them on their way. As I mentioned on the map, they would have headed northways along the way to Shur through the hill country, and they went to Bezek and mustered with the 30,000 other men from Judah and met again with the 300,000 men from the other tribes of Israel. Now, messengers from Jabesh Gilead were sent back to their people with news that the armies of Israel would come across the Jordan River and deliver their people from the Ammonites. In 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 9 it says, "By the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be delivered." And so of course, what would that mean? By the time the sun is hot tomorrow. What time of day do you think that is? Midday. Because we're talking about not light, we're talking about heat. So usually the hottest part of the day is determined by midday to early afternoon. In 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 11 it reads, "The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day." And so we find this is fulfilling what was actually prophesied. Sentries were posted throughout the night. There was not much chance to rest, so we're going to have a look at the story behind those scriptures now. There was not much chance to rest. Jesse's sons, Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah, who would have been there, had been separated into one of the 3 divisions of men early in the 3rd watch between midnight and 3 in the morning. Together they crossed the Jordan River to the eastern side. Under strict orders to maintain silence during their approach, their leader manoeuvred them into position during the last watch of the night between 3 and 6 in the morning. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon to the east, the signal was given and the Israelites rushed into the Ammonite camp outside Jabesh Gilead. As the Bible says, they fought until midday, until finally they were exhausted and had beaten the Ammonites. There were only a few Ammonite survivors. They were the ones who had scattered during the skirmish. The battle won, Saul dismissed the people, each to their own home. So we find as 330,000 Israelites came together, snuck across the river in the night, surrounded the Ammonites and completely devastated, and they were done by lunchtime. And so they used an overwhelming force. But the point is that instead of being scared by the threats they received, they actually came together and God assured them of a victory. And of course this is what happened. When Saul had been revealed to the people of Israel as the man the Lord had chosen to rule over them, there were some troublemakers who despised him. But now that Saul had proven himself in battle against the Ammonites, the people of Israel asked Samuel who were the people who had questioned the appointment of Saul as king over them. They wanted to put them to death. Neither Saul nor Samuel were interested in any more conflict between the people of Israel. They understood that this was a time to reunite the nation of Israel as one people. Samuel called the people of Israel together assembly again, this time at Gilgal, and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. The people of Israel sacrificed fellowship, or what's known as a peace offering, before the Lord, and the Israelites joined together in a great celebration. So just to mark the place, so this is Gilgal here. So when the Israelites first came across the Jordan River, before they took Jericho, Gilgal was the place that they very first settled. So this is where the battle was here. So obviously these people came back, and this place was still being used to gather the people. One of the reasons places like this are used as well is there's a lot of space. It's a flat area beside the river there, so it would have been possible to assemble them all together. Now Jesse and his family had responded yet again to the assembly at the call of Samuel. So we're going to go through the details of this. This time they've been asked to go to Gilgal near Jericho. When all the Israelites had arrived, Saul was brought before them, and Samuel confirmed his anointing as king in the presence of the Lord. They all celebrated together and made offerings before the Lord. When they all had their fill of food and drink, Samuel again addressed the people of Israel. In his speech, he mentioned how he had listened to them and given them what they wanted. He told of how, despite their sin in serving foreign gods, the Lord had rescued them from their own evil and that of the oppressors since the time of Egypt. But he also told them that despite the Lord their God being their king, they still chose another. And so we have this significant moment where they're actually putting Saul in front of all of the people at the same time and saying, he is your leader. And so they want to settle this once and for all so that the Israelites stop being divided from amongst each other. So Samuel made it clear that though they had their own earthly king, in reading from 1 Samuel chapter 12 now, verses 14 to 15, he said, if you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your fathers. Then at Samuel's word, God sent thunder and rain during the wheat harvest, when rain seldom or never falls. And in 1 Samuel chapter 12 verse 18, it says, so all the people stood in awe of the Lord and Samuel. So this was a demonstration of power, a supernatural power, illustrated to the newly appointed king and people of Israel that God was still the sovereign, all-powerful king who ruled over them. This struck them with great fear, and they repented, not just for the sins of their past, but also for the evil of asking for a king today. They asked Samuel to intercede for them, which he promised to do, but he again warns them in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 24 to 25. Fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, otherwise both you and your king will be swept away. And so all of this part of the Bible, we've got a newly anointed king, and they went to win this battle. And two things have happened. First of all, God promised them that he would sweep the enemy from before them, which he did. And then when they came together and anointed him, with both Samuel there as the person acting on behalf of God, and the king who's actually there to represent his people to God, we see this supernatural event happen where the rains fell. And so people knew that this was actually something that was coming from God at this important time. So we see this big shift happening because we've had 400 years during the time of Judges in which people were not united. So from the start of his reign, King Saul's son Jonathan was with him, forming an army they set out against the Philistines, but almost immediately King Saul disobeyed the Lord's command. Samuel prophesied the end of Saul's kingship and spoke of another that the Lord will appoint to lead his people. In 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 14 it says, "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his own people." Now next week we're going to start teaching David's story, because we're following the genealogy of Jesus. And so David is the 14th person listed in the genealogy of Jesus. But his story is a big story, and all of the interactions that happen with Saul and Jonathan are all going to be embedded in that story. So this story at the moment that we're looking at now, we're just tailing off the end of Jesse's journey, which is his father. And so the perspective that we're looking for is we're actually painting the picture, if you will, setting the scene for what's to actually come. Now, when in 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 14 it reads, "But now your kingdom will not endure," speaking to Saul, "the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people." Well, of course, this person was David. And so he's the future son of Jesse from Bethlehem. In 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 1, so we're jumping around a bit with the scriptures, it says that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. During this time, Jesse fathered another son called David. So Jesse had 7 sons. We find that David was the youngest. And so at this point in the story that we've been talking about with this battle with Jabesh Gilead, for example, and Saul, David wasn't around at this point in time. And so when we read here that there's going to be another one that's going to be appointed for his people, this is prophetic because David's not around yet. It's before David's time. And how do we know that? We know that because the time span in the scripture that I just gave you in 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 1 says that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. Right? The story of David that people are most familiar with usually is Goliath. And of course he comes at Goliath as a boy with a sling. Okay? So at this point in time we're not talking about David specifically because he actually isn't in the picture at this point in time. So during this time, Jesse fathered another son, as I was just talking about, David. And David's birth date is given as 1040 BC, 1040 BC. So David was the last of the children that Jesse fathered. There were the 3 sons I've already mentioned, Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah. Then there were 3 more sons called Nathaniel, Radai and Ozem. You can read, these are listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verses 13 to 15. David also had another brother who's not mentioned by name because he had actually passed away. And we find that in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 12. And he had 2 sisters called Zeruiah and Abigail, and we find that in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 16. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 we find the genealogy associated with this period of time, so you want to have a look at that. But it helps us here because we're painting this picture of Jesse, how many kids he has, and of course as we switch through today we find out that he has these brothers. He has a brother that didn't make it, and he has 2 sisters as well. So during the time of King Saul's reign, the 12 united tribes of Israel pursued the Philistines, but they did not overcome them. King Saul fought against the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the kings of Zobar, and inflicted punishment on them. He also fought against the traditional enemy of the Israelites, but he defeated them. These, of course, were the Amalekites, who had attacked their forefathers in the desert when they escaped from Egypt. But again, King Saul defeated the Amalekites, and he disobeyed the Lord, and Samuel confronted him. Although King Saul begged him for forgiveness and confessed his sin, he was told in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 26, You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. And so we hear here, we've been teaching on the weekends about faith, and we talk about the fact that we have to align ourselves. We have to hear the word of the Lord, we have to obey his will, and then we find that God will fulfill his promise to you. And so we find at this point in the Bible that Saul was anointed as king. God gave him a promise, but Saul disobeyed him. He didn't listen to the word of God. He didn't align himself with the will of God. And as a consequence, this promise is now broken. And we find that he's gone from being selected to rule over the nation of Israel to being rejected as their king. So when Samuel left him this time, the Bible tells us that he mourned for King Saul, but he never saw him again. The Lord said to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Frightened that King Saul will kill him if he knows the reason for his visit to Bethlehem, God tells Samuel in 1 Samuel 16 verses 2 to 3, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." And so we see here, many years before David's actually born, that instructions are actually being given to Samuel as to what he's actually to do when he meets the appointed child. God actually hasn't revealed him. He doesn't actually name him here. He actually tells him that he'll let him know, he'll indicate which one he is when he meets him. So having witnessed the Lord's power, when Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, the elders were trembling in fear. Samuel told the elders to consecrate themselves and come with him to offer the sacrifice. He told Jesse and his sons to do the same. So again, we're looking from Samuel's point of view. This is one of Samuel's last duties that he will actually do. But before continuing to follow the journey of each of the descendants through the genealogy of Jesus, I'm going to take some time this week to review the genealogical charts that I've prepared so that you can gain some insight and understanding into the many kings. This is a complicated part of the Bible, just as it is Judges. Many people, many locations, many battles, and so this is going to provide you with an oversight, and then next week we're going to step into David's story in a full way. So we're looking to give you a chance to familiarise yourself with their names, their kingdoms, and the relationship they had to one another. Of course, this is being filmed. I'm going to put them up on the screen behind me and explain it all. And so it's an opportunity for you to re-watch it. The videos will be uploaded onto YouTube for your future viewing as well as on Facebook. Now, King Saul, he sought to unite the kingdom of Israel. So I'll just put the first of these charts up. And so you can see here this picture first of all. So this is a representation of David. This is the horn we just spoke about, where Samuel was told to fill the horn with oil, and he's anointing him. You can see he's literally pouring the horn full of oil over the head of David. And the oil was poured over the head of sheep when they were actually anointed, where this practice originally came from. And so it is actually this full horn. These people here, they're in Bethlehem. This is probably Jesse, his father. And you can see this harp here in front. Now, this is just to sort of bring this sort of scene to life that's yet to come. But we're going to start at the top here, where we've got King Saul as the first king of Israel. We know he's going to die, and as a result, when he dies, the kingdom is actually going to separate. So the work that he's put into fighting to consolidate is going to come apart. Now King Saul, of course, he has a son, and his name is Ishbosheth. And he thinks, well, I'm the son, so I'm the legal heir to the kingdom, to the throne. And so he contests that throne. So even though David is being anointed, we find that Ishbosheth steps in to rule Israel. As I've said here, he only rules Israel for 2 years, and so it's very limited. David comes along and he rules Judah only for 7 years. So what this is telling us is that as David started to take control, he never automatically ruled over the whole of the country because it wasn't actually unified, nor were the people, because of this split between these loyalties, because of who was actually the inheritance here. Now, we go from David. Ishbosheth is actually defeated by David, and then we move into what became known as the United Kingdom of Israel for the first time. David's son, so these ones in orange, is Solomon. There's obviously other sons, and then we have these other people who make claims on the kingdom. One's called Adoniah. He claims both kingdoms but fails, killed by Solomon. And Absalom takes both kingdoms from David but fails and dies. Now this is a brief summary. This is quite a big task. So I'm not going to explain all the details this week, but to give you an outline of what's to come. Now Absalom was actually had a daughter called Maacah, and the daughter Maacah had a child with Solomon, who of course was Rehoboam. Now Rehoboam, he became the next descendant after Solomon, but because Solomon did the wrong thing when he was ruling, we find that Rehoboam ends up inheriting a kingdom which is literally going to split straight away. And so this very short period of time, we find that the kingdom of Israel is now 2, and in the north we have their first king called Jeroboam I, and it's known as the northern kingdom of Israel. It's also known as Samaria, as another name. And then of course the southern kingdom of Israel is also known as the kingdom of Judah. And so we find that they split into these 2 pathways. When we start tracking through the northern kingdom, there's a lot going on. There's people coming and going and killing each other. It's not good. Whereas when we follow the path, as we go on to the next slide, of those from the southern kingdom of Judah, we find that it goes from descendant to descendant to descendant. It's a much cleaner path. Now, Jeroboam, he has a son called Nadab, and he's killed by Baasha with all the other descendants of Jeroboam. So his line, you can still use these 2 colours here, it actually stops here. So it gets to the next generation and it's finished. They're all wiped out. And it gets taken over by this fellow called Baasha, who then gets an inheritance passed on to Elah. And Elah is now killed by this fellow called Zimri, who rules for only 7 days, who in turn is now killed by Omri. And then his descendant is Ahab, who you're no more familiar in the Bible, King Ahab. Okay, and he marries Jezebel, which is very famous in the Bible. So you can see in this short period of time here, all these changes. In the same time, we go from Abiah to Asa to King Jehoshaphat in the genealogy of Jesus. So we find that this is a more stable kingdom, whereas over here, because Jeroboam I wasn't walking with God, what we find is that this state is pretty much in anarchy. It's a power struggle all the time, and different people have their sights on the throne. They don't respect the authority of those who are ruling. Okay, so now moving on to the next slide. And again, there's a lot going on. So this yellow line here, this follows the genealogy of Jesus. So we go from Jehoshaphat to Jehoram, and his wife was actually Ahab's daughter Athaliah. The next descendant is Ahaziah, and it reads here, Athaliah ruled for 6 years after Ahaziah was actually killed. When he was killed, they were killed with all of the relatives on Jehu's order. Now he's over here in the northern kingdom. I'll pop back there in a moment. So he has a son called Joash, but Joash was only very little. And so he was actually hidden by the daughter of Jehoram, who's known as Jehosheba, until he's anointed at the age of 7, and then the Queen Athaliah is then put to death after he's anointed. So you see there's a lot going on. This is the simple pathway. The son of Amaziah is Uzziah. There's an illustration of King Uzziah there. He was the king who actually got leprosy, and so he was shown that he had to leave the palace and live outside the town according to the laws of skin diseases. And then the descendants from there go from Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Amon, who ended up being assassinated by palace officials. So while they're on their pathway, the northern kingdom, where we finished off on the previous slide, was on King Ahab, who married Jezebel. Now their son, Ahaziah, he actually died with no sons, but he had a brother. And so the crown went across to his brother Joram, but he was then killed by Jehu, and who was anointed king of Israel by the prophet Elisha. Now Jehu is the son of Jehoshaphat and the grandson of Nimshi. So at this point in time you think, oh, well hang on, that's good, isn't it? There'll be some alignment between the two. Well, there was, but the alignment was they both wanted to join together, but they didn't agree about who was going to lead. The person in the north, Jehu, yes, I'll align with you, let's unite the nation, but under me. And of course in the south, it was the opposite way around, you come together under me. And so it never actually happened. There was an opportunity there for the two halved nations to come back together. Then it scrolls through, just here first, all of King Ahab's family and the descendants, and this is a prophetic word which came from Elisha, it actually says that they will actually die. So in other words, their generations will come to an end altogether. And why? Does anyone know why? You know the story of Jezebel, perhaps? Because they were very wicked. And so they were condemned, they were cursed. And so they would come to an end altogether. Then we pass through these descendants, Jehoahaz, Jehoash, and this is where it gets complicated because some of these names recur on the other side. So when we're reading the Bible, it flips back and forth between north and southern kingdom, and so it can get really messy trying to follow it all. So having a chart helps us to go back to that chart and to identify who is actually who as we're going. Then we come down to Jehoash and Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II is not a descendant of Jeroboam I. It was just a title seen as the first king, so it was an honorarium, and you can see that this is all descendants of Jehu because of the difference in the colour. So he has a child called Zechariah, and he's assassinated by this fellow called Shalom, who actually ruled, so he only ruled for 6 months. Shalom in turn was assassinated by Menahem, and he only got to rule for 1 month. Could you imagine living in this kingdom? It's just utter chaos. There's just death after death. His son is called Pekahiah, and he's assassinated by Pekah, and he ruled for 2 years, and of course Pekah is assassinated by Hoshea. When we get to this point, he ruled for 9 years, so he was probably the most stable ruler of all. But the circumstances historically is that the Assyrians under King Shalmaneser conquered the Israelites of the northern kingdom of Israel and took its people captive to Assyria. So at this point in time, the period of kings in the northern Israel ceased to exist and it was no longer an independent nation. Okay, it becomes swamped, absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. And so we find the southern kingdom is still going, northern kingdom has come to a close. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Oops. Okay, and so we're here now, we're back to just one kingdom, so it gets a little bit easier to follow. King Amon was the last one. Now I haven't gone into all the details of each of the kings, who are the good kings, the bad kings, because there's a lot of information there, but we're just picking up from that. But King Amon was assassinated by palace officials, so he was obviously not a good guy. His own guys took him out. They didn't leave him to continue to rule. His son was Josiah, and he ended up being killed in battle against the Egyptians. And Josiah was a good king, excepting he didn't obey. He didn't let the Egyptian ruler pass through, and he ended up being killed by an arrow. And so that was unfortunate. His son was called Joahaz, and then we find this breakdown at the end of the king's period. He ruled for 3 months. His circumstances that he was taken to Egypt as a prisoner, and he was replaced by the Egyptian king Necho, who made his brother Eliakim king of Judah, and he changed his name to Jehoiakim. And so at this point in time, they were actually submitted to the authority of the Egyptians. Jehoiakim had his son here, Jehoiakim, and his period of rule ended up only being 3 months as well. The circumstances of this is that the Babylonians took over the kingdom of Judah, and so they deposed the ruler and changed him over. So the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar conquered the Israelites of Judah. They took Jehoiakim and his people as captives to the Babylon. So he was the one that was taken away with the hook through his cheek, and he was replaced by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, made Jehoiakim's uncle Mattaniah king, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So again, all these names are in the Bible, so all the names have changed, and so we move to Zedekiah's period of rule. So he was the last ruler, and he was to rule for 11 years, but he decided that he was doing pretty well, so he decided he would rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And so he ended up being captured, and he was forced to watch the execution of his sons, and then he had his eyes put out and taken captive to Babylon. Okay. The interesting thing, we'll go into this in more detail, is that when he arrived in Babylon, Jehoiakim was already there in the palace, in the prison. So these guys ended up in the same palace prison together, and upstairs in the palace, of course, was whom? Daniel. So Daniel was there ruling on behalf of, so these two guys are in the prison and Daniel's up top ruling, so all their stories coalesce together. And so he was replaced by this fellow called Gedaliah. So the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah replaced with a governor, and so there are no more kings. And the governor's name was called Gedaliah, and he ended up being killed, and the remaining people of Judah fled to Egypt. And at this point in time, this brings us to the close of the periods of kings in the Bible, and ended with the period of Judah ceasing to exist as an independent nation. The illustration here is them breaking down the temple, the Chaldeans, and so the Chaldeans are those who have come under Nebuchadnezzar, and so when they actually went in, they destroyed the actual temple. Okay, so this was the temple destruction happening. So there's a lot going on, as I said, so that's to give you an outline. So our next journey is going to take us through all of these kings. Right? So we're going to basically endeavour on another 400-year odd journey, and there's a lot actually going to go on.
So would that be estimated about 600 BC, the end of this area?
Yeah, 586 BC.
586.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll go into all the dating, the details and the stories, the events that happened, the history at the time, of course what the Bible's saying. There's a lot of history around this period of time that's recorded from other kingdoms, and so there's a lot of very easy to find support for what the Bible actually says was actually happening, because it was happening and recorded in history as well. The only problem with history is, unfortunately, it gets recorded differently by different rulers, and so we find a lot of the time that there's disagreements with the Bible, and people try to justify that the Bible doesn't tell the truth. The problem is, however, is that in history, when you have two different kings from opposing nations in a battle, if you actually go into the museums and records today, you'll see that both kings are claiming victory for the same battle. Mm-hmm. And so there's truth bent all the time, because kings would embellish their achievements when they went home, because the people at home didn't know what was going on, unless they actually had an invader come in and take over them. And so they would go home and they would say, look, we've won this great battle, we're an extraordinary power, And then the other people would head home and say, oh, there's not many of us left, but we beat them, we scored this great victory. So they record them on the steels, they're stones, they would carve into them. You'll find them in museums today, and yet you'll find that they have opposing opinions on them. And so when we look at history, we've just got to be really careful that we don't treat everything as being factual either. The interesting thing is there's always an alignment with the Bible in history, right? Because one of those two sides appears in the Bible as the victor. And so we can sort all of that stuff out through that means. So basically, this brings us to a shorter close today, because this is the time of the Bible where we're finding this outline is really, really important to help us. So I'm just going to finish up with a little bit of information about Samuel. So first of all, I did say to you before in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, that the Lord said to Samuel, I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. So whilst all the descendants of Abraham were significant forefathers of Jesus Christ, Jesse was set apart from those who came before him. When his forefathers first came to the land of Canaan, they were a mighty nation of conquerors obedient to the will of God. They were blessed to fulfill the promise of the covenant, but Jesse, even though he was a righteous man, had to raise his family during an often lawless time in which the Israelites chose to worship other foreign gods. Although God raised up leaders called judges to lead the Israelites out from under the yoke of foreign oppression during these dark times, they eventually asked for an earthly king to rule over them. So Jesse, who we've been following, and so we're going to move over to David next week. Jesse's still alive, but we're going to start following the story from David's point of view. Jesse was just an ordinary man from this small village of Bethlehem, and yet his son David was chosen to rule over the people of Israel. And so we find that the genealogy of Jesus in the opening passage in verse 1 talks about the connection between Abraham, David and Jesus. And so we find here that we move into a very significant moment, because David's going to have a huge impact on the nation of Israel. And so he's obviously very well known. And the reason that he becomes so well known is not only is he someone who has incredible faith in God, as we learned in the early part of the story when he takes on Goliath, but he's actually the first person who's able to unite Israel since they went into the land. Because the story tells us all the way through, they constantly came together, fell apart, or they were regionally together here and regionally together there, but they were never always united together. We see in the story of King Saul, somewhat brief, but we spoke about tonight, you see that he went out to battle against the Philistines and a few of the others, the Ammonites and the Moabites, but he never succeeded in overcoming all of them. The problem is that King Saul took it upon himself to do it the way that he wanted to do it, and he ended up walking away from God as a result of doing so. And so his tenure, it's quite long. I mean, the Bible tells us he ruled for 42 years. The problem is that the inheritance that would come from him to pass down through his family was taken away from him because of his disobedience to God. And so there's a message in there for us as well. To be blessed, we need to align ourselves with the will of God and the Word of God. And when we don't, God takes things away. And so David was selected. He was obviously just a little boy who was a shepherd in a small village with his father. If we look at him and think, well, why did God select him? Again, it wasn't about what he had. It wasn't about whether he was wealthy. It didn't matter about his education. It didn't matter about what equipment he had. It was never about that, and yet he became a king. The thing with David was he was selected because of who he was as a person. David was righteous. David walked with the Lord. David believed that all things were possible with God. As he did, he took on enemies which were far superior to himself, and yet he won. And so we see the significant switch point happening here, where David is going to be that person who unites the people of Israel together. So, so he's a seed, if you will. If we look at David, he comes from this small village. He came from Jesse. Jesse wasn't a leader, but he was a seed, and of course he's a seed that's planted by God, and he's going to grow into a mighty tree. And so next week we're going to begin on the journey with David and his story. So I'm going to draw it to a close tonight, unless there's any questions. Anyone have any questions? There's going to be a lot of questions about the charts. There's a lot of information on them. As I said, you can play it back and review the charts there. At some point in time I will be releasing a book with all of this in that can be purchased. But at this point in time we're just doing this to show you, to give you an outline of what's to come. And obviously we need to give you the story in portions where the information joins together in alignment with the Bible and the events that happen there. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm going to bid good night to those of you who have joined us online.